And I'm going to introduce, first of all, my colleague Jordan, who is a member of the Views team at the University of Cambridge, where he is exploring the place of writing in ancient Egyptian and Maya visual cultures.
Thank you, Philip. And for my Views work, I am working on a comparative study of Egypt and the Maya. For today's talk, I'm going to stay within more familiar territory. I trained as an Egyptologist, so I'm going to focus on ancient Egypt. One of the most iconic features of ancient Egyptian civilization is its writing, which was often done in a script that we describe as hieroglyphic. What I want to do today is take our understandings, and there are many, of what a hieroglyph is, and make them play tug of war with ancient Egyptian terminology. And my focus is on this ancient Egyptian word, TJT, that's a transliteration. We could pronounce it something like teat. And that is commonly translated as image, symbol, written sign, hieroglyph. And these are translations, they're not definitions. None of them are wrong per se, they just work more or less well in different contexts because the concept doesn't map neatly onto our ways of categorizing and experiencing images. A very popular, simple definition of a hieroglyph is a sign in writing with a strongly pictorial character. And a hieroglyphic script would therefore consist of a vast inventory of such signs. And how the script encodes language, whether it's morphographic, syllabographic, etc., that's not as relevant. The common understanding really foregrounds visual experience, and that's why we speak of Egyptian hieroglyphs, Maya hieroglyphs, Cretan hieroglyphs sometimes. But in their recent and very seminal exploration of how we may characterize a hieroglyphic script, the Mayanist Steve Houston and the Egyptologist Andreas Schauder argue that hieroglyphs exhibit properties of substantiality and performativity to an intense, concentrated degree. So it's that density of visual potentials that defines the hieroglyphic. But as I will try to illustrate with some Egyptian examples, there is great fluidity in usage. Some figural signs can be far more hieroglyphic than others, and some Egyptian writing might even mobilize these hieroglyphic properties to a lesser extent than specialized uses of scripts that we would not ordinarily classify as hieroglyphic. And so it becomes quite difficult to know where to draw the line. So I want to build on Houston and Schauder's heuristic approach and flesh it out with some clearer parameters and try to interrogate what the ancient Egyptians themselves said about writing and what they treated as writing. The Egyptians had a vast array of terms for describing images, and many of them were, like teat, part of the broader category of seh or sesh. This is translated as writing or drawing. But as far as I know, teat is the only Egyptian concept that kind of teases out certain properties that we would ordinarily assign to an independent category that we call writing. But there was no such firm division in Egypt because teat can also designate things that we call pictures, as well as closely related things such as statues, the bodies of kings. Sometimes celestial bodies are called teat. Eternity itself is also called teat in one hymn to the sun god. And those connections kind of trouble our intuitions. So teat entangles relationships between writing and pictures, representation and reality, image and substance. These are issues that Western art historians and philosophers have grappled with for decades, if not centuries. And by really interrogating those relationships, we can begin reshaping the conceptual frameworks that we use to talk about writing. So what it is, what it involves, and what it can be. And in the process of doing so, I will be touching very briefly on issues of writing system complexity and fit, especially in terms of how people cognitively and physiologically identify what writing is and how they process it, and how these are socially conditioned. So I say that a teat can represent an element of spoken language whilst being substantial, sensorial, and personal. And by substantial, I mean that when something is a teat, it hovers between a representation of language, a representation of something or someone in the world, and the status of those representations as beings in their own right, potentially equal to human persons, and often with a physical presence. So teat kind of lies, it's always in between, it never really falls into the box of a single of those categories. And this is where sensoriality comes in. The concept of teat introduces alternative understandings of what it means to read and write in cultures such as Egypt, where the script was not necessarily divorced from the rest of the observable world. So Iris earlier, she mentioned, she talked about how these triangular forms are really part of the Southern African visual culture. And I mean, the Egyptians were very astute observers of the natural world, and their script really kind of integrates the whole kind of world in all its varied forms and establishes different relationships between them. So a teat can be a visual, tactile, aesthetic experience, or even a spectacle. And so writing was processed in quite complex ways. And by personal, I mean that teat, or rather tiut, if you want to use the plural form, they were understood to interact with the world and with human and other non-human persons, even if the ways that they achieve this are not immediately clear. So Egyptologists often describe it as magical. And this is very much a sociocultural feature. And we can observe the interplay of these different potentials or parameters from two angles. On one hand, graphemes, so elements of writing that are organized into readable lines and columns of text, they can serve as bodies for humans and gods. And conversely, adorning and comporting the body in certain ways can be forms of writing. That's what I argue, and they produce legible images. And so these are two opposite transformations. And if we grapple with both prongs, we can try to roughly scope out the core of what makes something a teat. So the concept operated in a visual culture, and if you want to use the term, an ontological system, a system of what exists and how do they relate to one another. A system where images could be beings, where the force and identity of beings could depend on how they are read, and where how they are read depends on their visual forms. So writing, pictures, bodies, and persons, they are four sides of the same coin, or four sides of the same prism, if you want to be topologically correct. So let's start with the idea that writing, and on a broader level, entire texts could constitute a corporeal personal presence. This is a very famous inscription for Egyptologists, at least. It's from the tomb chapel of a man called Nefermat and his wife Itet. This is now in Chicago. This dates to the mid-3rd millennium BC, and is perhaps the earliest reference to that conceptual nexus I'm trying to bring into focus. And it might be the most explicit formulation, even though it doesn't actually use the word teat. And as far as I know, we don't get comparable expressions from later periods, which makes this example all the more exceptional, because earlier texts are generally much more restricted in what they deal with and how they express it. Here, written signs are called gods, and they are made in writing, seh, that cannot be erased. The inscriptions, the gods of Nefermat, were made in sunk relief that was then filled with colored paste. And I want you to keep that in mind as I move on to later examples. This technique seems to have been short-lived and local to this place called Meidum, where his tomb was found. But I wonder if it speaks to wider concepts surrounding the materiality of writing and its relationship with the surface, what we might separate out conceptually as the medium. And I'll get back to this slightly later. Two more texts from the 2nd millennium BC, so several centuries after this brief inscription, can help us to explore that relationship in more detail. This is part of a very long biography of an official called Khnumhotep. This was inscribed on the walls of his tomb at the site of Beni Hassan, and it includes this passage. I enlivened, so the Egyptian word is sunk, the names of my forefathers, which I had found effaced on the doorways, recognizable by teeth and perfectly legible without placing one, or possibly one man, in the company of another. What did it mean to enliven the ancestors' names? The word sang doesn't mean to renew or to renovate. We get a word that does mean that, sema, semao, from other texts. And indeed, that word, semao, has a sense of transforming the work, of kind of going beyond what was there previously. And this is not something you can really do with a name. More broadly, to enliven could mean to provide for, such as when a lord takes care of his dependents. But again, this doesn't seem appropriate in the context. As we see from the picture, the writing is painted onto the walls, and often the paint is a way of filling in relief carvings. Pigment is often the first thing to fade and flake off when an ancient building falls into disrepair. Next come weathering and erosion, when shifting humidity levels might cause salt to precipitate on the surface, or sand might batter the building and kind of erode the surface. And so his claim that the names were still recognizable by teeth, I wonder if this suggests that the damage to the inscriptions did not involve substantial destruction of the surface. So perhaps the shape of the signs could still be made out, but surface treatment such as color or fine sculpted detailing was lost. And perhaps he restored these features and gave the inscriptions a new lease of life. And I then wonder if this helps to make sense of a slightly later biography of another man called Ameneseneb. He was commissioned by the king to restore a temple. And he describes how his workers filled in the walls with frits, clays, and teat. I haven't managed to find another example where the word teat refers to a kind of substrate or artistic medium. And I wonder if its use here speaks to that tangible presence of the images where they're placed alongside materials like paint and frit. They were part of the fabric of the structure. They're not merely ornament or decoration. Now, ancient Egyptian sculptures were called sanghu. They were enliveners, but they weren't usually the ones performing the rituals that made these sacred images come to life. So that was the job of priests. Sculptures rather ensured that the images were appropriately and correctly formed so that they were receptive to those transformations and they could function correctly thereafter. And you might recognize this from Kim's lecture yesterday. When the famous artist René Magritte said, "This is not a pipe," he meant that the image of the pipe was not actually a pipe, because you cannot stuff the image as you would a real pipe. You can't smoke this image. But the technical processes of making images in Egypt, in some cases, make that argument moot. Magritte also made distinctions between ideas, signs, and the reference, what is being referred to. So the word forest and the picture of a forest both refer to the idea of a forest. Now, those boundaries become fuzzy when we deal with pictorial scripts, such as that of Egypt. But in the very same article, Magritte made a far more relevant observation. He said, in a painting, the words are of the same substance as the images. That is true of Ameneseneb's temple renovations in a very literal sense. It is true of the Egyptian word seh, which refers to writing as well as drawing. And it is true to the technical processes of making Egyptian writing. So Magritte couldn't stuff his pipe, but Nefermat could fill his gods, and Khnumhotep and Ameneseneb filled walls with gods. In my opinion, this has implications for how we define hieroglyphs. The layperson might call them written signs with a pictorial character, but those categories of writing and picture are unwieldy, and they don't give us the full picture of how people engage with images as visual and material things. Highly pictorial scripts were open to, and indeed they demand different kinds of visual engagement. And so when we read them, in some ways we are viewing them similarly to how we might view other kinds of images. And this doesn't mean, of course, that we should simply tear down all our categories and say there's no such thing as writing, there's no distinction between writing and pictures. The Egyptians did differentiate what was text, what was image when they laid out these visual works. And it would be very disingenuous of us to try and claim otherwise. Rather, we need to take those tensions as a motivation to reshuffle our own categories and think about new ways of relating them so that we can accommodate these diverse practices. So moving on, more examples. On the right here, there is part of a Book of the Dead papyrus belonging to a man called Yuya. So this is from the 18th dynasty, about 1370 BC. And a colophon, so kind of a little note left by the scribe at the end, confirms that the entire manuscript was accurately transcribed and edited. It was checked teeth by teeth, perhaps sign by sign. And if you go back to Khunamohotep's biography, we remember that phrase, without placing one man in the company of another. And the second occurrence of he, I say one man because it includes this little hieroglyph depicting a seated man. And this made me wonder, does the text refer to an accurate restoration that didn't misplace or conflate the names of different ancestors, since these inscriptions and tombs, they don't just have biographies, they have statements of descent, affiliation. It's very important to kind of know your place and your history in that kind of social environment. So are these texts referring to individual written signs in the script? It seems plausible. The signs are discrete, they don't overlap, they're not ligatured. And when you write in hieroglyphs, there's not a fixed spelling. Words can vary in their spelling, so you can adjust the spelling depending on certain poetic connotations you might want to bring out. You might make it shorter if you're running out of space, or expand the spelling if you're trying to fill a large amount of space. And so the copyists are working at the level of individual signs, so what we could call graphemes, the smallest graphic units of a script. So something like the letters in our alphabet, A, B, C, they're the smallest units. And on some Book of the Dead manuscripts, there's evidence that inexperienced scribes actually got confused between similarly shaped signs. So if two signs were both tall, narrow, and vertical, sometimes they wrote the wrong sign, and it kind of creates a word that's spelt incorrectly. Now, hieroglyphs are usually contrasted with two other Egyptian scripts, hieratic and demotic. These are typically treated as cursive analogs of non-ligatured, discrete, figural hieroglyphs. Hieratic was used alongside hieroglyphs from the earliest times, and demotic emerged in the early first millennium BC and is even more schematic in its forms. It's been argued that these cursive scripts were processed differently by their users. So at least in the Ramesside period, this was the example I found, hieratic may have been learned by word groups or sign clusters rather than, working based on individual signs. And hieratic spelling is also far more consistent than its less cursive analogs. And sometimes inexperienced scribes or students got confused not between similarly shaped signs, but between similarly shaped words. So they might write Weja storehouse instead of Weja to be well, to be whole, because the words have similar overall shapes in writing, not because they are close in meaning or sound, or because the final signs look similar, because they don't. And from a purely anecdotal perspective, I like to compare this with how my friends and I grew up in Singapore. We used to get confused between similar looking Chinese characters when we were in school. They make you pause and think, is this the one with the tick or the one without? Is this the one with the long stroke on top or the one where the long stroke is on the bottom? And so confusion in hieratic occurs on the scale of the whole word. You see the shape, the overall contour of the word, not the individual signs as in hieroglyphic writing. And expert transcribers in ancient Egypt knew the differences between hieratic and hieroglyphic, and they could move between these systems with some effort. And again, another comparison with Chinese, the process of reading traditional versus simplified characters. So I learned the simplified script. I can generally read traditional characters because I'm familiar with common strategies of how these traditional characters were simplified. And so I can reverse engineer the traditional character. But I imagine I I don't have any first-hand experience of this, but I imagine it's easier for someone who initially learned traditional to then move into simplified, because many simplified characters retain the basic shape, basic symmetries of the traditional form. And so, it's sometimes, or rather, it's often easier to subtract from maximal input than it is to add to a minimal amount of data. And I wonder if this made the strongly figural script in ancient Egypt less accessible to people who were literate or who worked predominantly in hieratic or worse, demotic, because you can reduce loads of complex signs to small ticks and you can recognize the word by its overall shape, but you then don't have enough information to reverse engineer the original sign from the output. And even when you're faced with strings of figural signs in hieroglyphic, you cannot read simply by looking at the shape of sign clusters because of the far more flexible layout. So these Egyptian scripts are variants of the same graphic system in terms of the inventory of signs. But when you actually start reading each script, you realize that they actually demand different modes of visual engagement. And the few people who continue to work with strongly figural forms could traverse those modes of engagement. And so when they dealt with hieroglyphs, readers and writers navigated what I like to call a kind of multi-dimensional graphic algebra, where it's not only about adding or subtracting from shapes, as we see in transcriptions between traditional and simplified Chinese, or between hieroglyphs and hieratic and demotic. And these issues that I've raised correspond to almost all the dimensions of writing system complexity, according to a model proposed by Peter Daniels and David Scher. So factors of spatial arrangement and linearity or non-linearity, visual uniformity and complexity, so allography, so the use of variant sign forms, dual purpose letters, where a small tick can stand for lots of different bird signs, for example, ligatures, and the size of the inventory. For later periods of Egyptian history, there's also another dimension of linguistic distance, because texts that were written in hieroglyphs were often in an archaic classical form of the language that was very different from the spoken vernacular. So just as demotic is a niche subfield of Egyptology today, hieroglyphs were a very niche subfield in antiquity. Mastering these various styles of visual engagement takes a lot of time, effort, and interest. It's not really for everyone. And so put more abstractly, we can discern different cultures of viewing within the Egyptian graphosphere, their worlds of writing. But the concept of teat, I think, so coming back to my main topic, it goes even further, claiming that if we claim that other kinds of images can be read in the same way as graphic marks on a surface, we're taking those graphic marks as primary, that context is primary, and the former as derivative. But I prefer to see those marks on a surface as sharing in that multifaceted visuality of other kinds of images, but they stress formal features over other aspects of visual experience. So it's about the cognitive load that's needed to process the visual stimuli. And in ancient Egypt, a truly masterful command of teat involved manipulating those relationships between formal and other aspects, even though most contexts of writing did not exploit those potentials to their fullest. So remember, again, we're dealing with intensities, not categories. So writing can be more or less substantial, more or less sensorial, more or less personal. In some cases, features that we deem as sensorial or aesthetic, such as color, could express nonverbal meanings. One of my colleagues, Marina Sartori, for example, she's studying how the use of colorful signs in manuscripts could reflect graphic registers. They connote things like sacredness or the monumentality of the text, among other things. But I wonder if, in some other cases, these sensorial and aesthetic experiences, they are morphographic in themselves. And so reflecting on aesthetic experience was functionally analogous to reading phonetic and logographic signs. So reading and writing then merge with broader visualities. Quick example, so King Amenhotep III from the mid-second millennium, he really leans into this. He loved the sun god. He described himself as glittering of appearances, with the word that often describes shiny rocks, shiny water. And this obsidian bust of him was set up in a really important temple. And during his reign, there was also a lot of construction of fancy statues that combine differently colored and textured stones. He also has these scarabs inscribed with texts. This is one of the lake scarabs. It's named because the text inscribed on it describes a large artificial lake that he constructed. And during a festival, he went out on the lake on a boat that he called the Glittering Sun Disk, Iten Chechen. And he actually assumed this epithet for himself later in his reign. And he also called himself the Teat of Ra. And Ra was the sun god at his most powerful, at his hottest and brightest in the middle of the day. So as a Teat, this king was in a way legible. So when the king is called the Teat of a god, I wonder if his body is read as if it were a statue. This is not new or even that rare. Here are several examples from before, from early periods, from later periods. It was through this dazzling sensorial experience that Amenhotep III, sailing on his fancy little lake, became legible as the sun. So writing is not just about perceiving and interpreting shapes. Ancient Egypt shows us that other worlds of writing are possible and workable. It can be based on other visual features. So here it pivots on luminosity, reflectivity, features such as color and sparkle that are precisely those that we disregard as irrelevant to reading and writing in our modern visual cultures. And ancient Egypt was a society where very few could read hieroglyphs, and the script that was used to write out these rarefied religious texts that vaunt the superhuman capacities of the king. And in such a society, seeing the king be sun-like in a public spectacle was far more impactful and far-reaching than any treatise or historical record could ever hope to be. And we have to remember that when the king sails on his lake, that's replicating a really common religious motif where the sun god sails across the sky in his boat. And just to finish up quickly, the most radical examples in our eyes are those that do away with form, or rather they subsume form into substance. So this is an ancient pen holder. It's made of wood. And there's a little blank space here where we would typically expect a sign like this, reading Mare. But Mare is a type of wood. And so the viewer is forced to kind of snap out of reading mode and consider what it is he's holding, viewing, feeling. So the space is not blank. I like to call it an antigraph. I'll get to that later. It subverts the understanding that hieroglyphs resemble things in the world, because this doesn't resemble wood, it is wood. And this is not a unique example. We have a few statues from the first millennium BC where the name of the god Amun, the hidden god, is written as a blank space. And this goes back to the third millennium as well. We have magic spells that refer to the god, he who is hidden of name, a snake called the Hidden One, and they use blank spaces as determinatives or classifiers. And we know that it's functioning as a classifier because there's a second classifier that comes after it for the snake, this actual snake. And so, strictly speaking, such spaces, they don't resemble hiddenness or concealment, because what would something invisible look like? And I think my term antigraph is apt, because in other versions of these spells, we have the blank space replaced with a pair of shrugging arms, which is a way of representing negation. So words in Egyptian that, this is not something, those negative words all include those arms. So think back to how Magritte said that in a painting, the words are of the same substance as the images, and also to how Nefermat called carved inscriptions on surfaces gods. These examples push the idea further. They say that words and images are substance. They're not a form impressed onto matter. And a couple of comparative examples later on, but I'm out of time, so I will skip it. Thank you.